Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch, and thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. So I'm Caitlin, and I'm a consultant at Cavell Group. I just started here about 6 months ago, and for this keynote, I'm joined by my colleague, Katie, who is an analyst here at Cavell. So as you might be able to tell, we're sort of a good bit younger than many of the faces in the crowd today, and we're part of sort of Gen Z, and we're sort of a loathed generation. So unfortunately for you all, we're becoming more and more a part of the workforce. And so as younger workers ourselves, Katie and I thought it might be really interesting to sort of investigate how different generations communicate and what sort of impact that has on our industry and future strategy. So sort of to go about that, we underwent some enterprise research where we surveyed 2,000 business technology users, so 1,000 from the US, 1,000 from the UK, and we asked a variety of different generations about their workplace communications habits, their telephony usage, if they like to work from home or in the office, and we actually came up with some really, really interesting results from that we're gonna share with you today.
So the main questions we wanted to address in the keynote today, kind of reiterating what Caitlin was just saying, what does a new worker look like in the wake of the pandemic, the rise of remote working, and what should service providers be doing in response in terms of product strategy and future roadmap? So before we begin, we thought we'd give a little overview of all the generations. So the generation that Caitlin and I are part of, born from 1997 to 2012. For full disclosure, I was born in 1998, so on the older end of that generation, but still very much part of Gen Z. Gen Z averages around 16.5% of the US and UK workforces. In the US, Gen Z workers are set to triple by 2030. Millennials are set to have about 3/4 of the UK workforce by 2025, and we're expecting significant growth from Gen Z as well. So we are going to become a much more relevant part of the workforce going forward. So to kick things off, we thought we'd give a little bit of a sort of overall sort of profile about Gen Z in terms of how they like to communicate. So we asked our respondents what was their sort of preferred communications methods in a business setting. And what might surprise people in this room is that email was the preferred option, and I think we can put that down to early adoption. I got my first email address at the age of 8, very familiar with it, so that's probably why we like using it in a business setting. Also, we like face-to-face, probably, again, due to the pandemic. We would like that sort of in-person interaction. But what we thought was quite interesting was that messaging platforms, so from the likes of Slack, Microsoft Teams, but also SMS and texting, really popular with Gen Z for business communications. We also thought it'd be really interesting to point out that video was quite low, surprisingly low. About 6% of Gen Z said that video was their preferred communication medium. We'll circle back to this later on in the keynote, but we thought it was quite an interesting point to bring up. So, no surprise to most of us, social media is really heavily used by Gen Z, and this is now really starting to filter through into work life, but not only in Gen Z, across all generations. Gen Z do use a wider range of social media platforms in business than other generations, especially with the likes of TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram. As you can see, Instagram is actually the 4th most commonly used social media platform by Gen Z, so really coming in strong. Snapchat as well was quite significantly used by Gen Z, especially when you compare the numbers to boomers. Only 3% of boomers use Snapchat in their work life, 22% of us do. WhatsApp was interesting. It was the most popular communication medium overall the generations, but only was it the case for Gen Z that SMS and texting was a more sort of significant medium of communication. So we thought, yeah, very, very relevant data coming through from that. In terms of technologically savvy generation, there are still some issues that Gen Z face in the workplace. So despite the fact that we are excited with the introduction of new technologies, we're more likely to use things like voice notes, emojis, kind of much more engaging mediums of communication. But we do struggle with the more sort of traditional business software, you could say. So a high proportion of us said that we struggled with using business tools such as CRM. We had similar rates of worry and frustration to sort of Gen X and boomers with regards to using new workplace technologies. You would expect us to be probably less worried and less frustrated with technology compared to some of the older generations, but that wasn't actually the case. And we think that this is kind of down to just a lack of familiarity with business tools and a bit of a training gap potentially. I know I struggle to use HubSpot, that's our CRM at Cavell, and I've never really been trained to use it properly. Employers would probably assume that Gen Z will be familiar with technology, but especially when it comes to business tools and sort of more complex sort of Microsoft Outlook, 365, all of that, it's not as familiar with us as you'd assume, and so we just don't use it as much in business communication. We're also, and we thought this was mildly offensive, the least favorite generation to work with. We're much happier working with other generations than they may be with us. So yeah, 1% of boomers said they preferred to work with us. I think 8% of Gen Z said that they like to work with baby boomers. So even that, we prefer to work with other generations. And there is this sort of negative perception around Gen Z. I think people assume we're quite entitled, maybe not as heavy working, the sort of snowflake generation, and that kind of permeates the discourse around Gen Z. We disagree with this massively, of course. And we hope that everyone in this room will hopefully feel more sympathetic by the end of this presentation as well.
But, all jokes aside, there's some really important takeaways that service providers can sort of glean from this Gen Z profile. So one, providers can leverage the fact that Gen Z have familiarity with social media. So this could look like more integration between social and business apps, more complex enterprise messaging solutions, and even thinking about, maybe amending product roadmaps to sort of cater to these communications preferences. Also, Gen Z workers are really excited about technology, which is good. So providers can capitalize on this excitement and look into things like the metaverse, AI, VR, and as the sort of oft-talked about ChatGPT. So these are all things that are really exciting for our industry. But also, as Katie mentioned, we're not the sort of tech-savvy screen-agers that maybe you all think that we are. So providers should continue to focus on UI and UX, which is something that our prior Cavell enterprise research has showed is important in comms purchasing decisions. And also, younger generations of workers still need training. So this could look like more investment in onboarding and sort of a different role for the MSP and sort of a different capacity for them in training younger workers. So those are some good takeaways.
So we thought we'd carry this on and talk a bit more about phone usage, and great news for people in this room. Phone and audio calls are far from dead, as was mentioned in one of the panels previously. So 48% of Gen Z have a sort of business phone system of some sort, 64% have a work phone number, so all very good for the industry. However, we do have slightly different habits when using the phone. So we tend to send a message before calling. And as we saw in the graph in the sort of first section, we do prefer just to message in general over taking a phone call. And what may be more concerning for providers in this room is that daily active use does go down the younger the employee. So 23% of Gen Z use their phone every day versus 54% of boomers. And we do think that Gen Z just have less familiarity and engagement with phone calling than with other generations. So for example, when we asked Gen Z if they didn't like to make phone calls, what was the reason? A lot of them said they had high levels of energy drain when placing phone calls, embarrassment to kind of phone calls as well. So there is this sort of phone guilt with Gen Z, which I think would be quite important for a lot of you to address as well. When it comes to job roles, we also found that this really does influence how people use a phone. So obviously Gen Z much more likely to be in entry-level, intermediate-level job roles. The more senior and therefore probably the more older the person, the more likely they were to have a phone number, and that was by quite a significant margin. It will be really interesting to see how this changes as sort of Gen Z become more senior and go more and more into the workforce and have sort of more of an impact on decision making. What we also found was that C-suite and sort of senior management level workers are much more likely to take a phone call from an unknown number. That's probably because C-suite and senior management workers are probably going to have more protected numbers, so will receive much more relevant phone calls to their work, whereas I would say we're probably Gen Z and millennials will probably receive more spam marketing calls, that kind of thing, so we'd be much less likely to take a phone call. One interesting thing that we also found, seeing as Caitlin's from the US, I'm from the UK, the US prefer phone calling a bit much more than the UK. I don't know why that was, but we could put that down to maybe some UK awkwardness, fear of interacting with strangers. That also seems to also impact our use of the phone as well.
And I would attribute it to excessive American chattiness, but that's just me. But there's some really interesting takeaways from this phone usage data. So one, there's still a big opportunity to sell telephony to Gen Z users, so yay. So as we've sort of talked about earlier, phone calling audio is even preferred to other mediums for Gen Zers, so that's good for the industry. But also providers should be aware that Gen Z have different usage habits and preferences than older generations. So in the future, if a provider is targeting a business with a younger demographic, say a startup, they might want to sort of add something on to sort of telephony, so maybe that's contact center, which has more chat functionality, so the Gen Zers don't have to pick up the phone, which we seem to be so afraid of doing. And so we should also be thinking about how providers can, keep track of Gen Z's phone usage and how it will evolve over time. So if we sort of get in early with telephony with these Gen Z workers, maybe that will sort of carry on when they're C-suite executives, which is also great for the industry. And also, as Katie mentioned, there's still sort of a gap where entry-level and Gen Z workers, they have less business mobiles than older generations and older workers. So there's an opportunity to sort of target that gap and do the typical cross-sell and upsell that comes with those business mobiles. So now we're going to sort of expand away from a technology-specific perspective, and we're going to talk about some really interesting findings that we found when it comes through different work from home and office working habits with the Gen Z generation. So really interestingly, we overall found that Gen Z finds work from home difficult. So 15% of Gen Z respondents said that a lack of social interaction is a main reason that they don't like working from home. And then 14% of respondents said that a lack of separation between work and home life makes working from home difficult, as well as a disruptive work environment. A particularly disgruntled respondent said that it's their cat actually that makes working from home really difficult, which I found kind of funny. But personally, as a Gen Z worker, I know that my flat is quite small, so my kitchen is my office, is my dining room, and is my living room. And so when my flatmate is trying to cook her lunch and I'm trying to take phone calls, it's sort of not the most productive environment. But it's not just a sort of distraction that is pushing Gen Z out of their homes and into the office. It's economic pressures as well. So a really interesting finding we found from this research is that 17% of Gen Z workers said that their primary reason for going to the office is to reduce work from home costs. So that's gas and heating. And I think all of us sort of in the UK know that the cost of living crisis is really difficult and is probably affecting a younger generation of workers more greatly than even older generations. But also it's definitely the social element, which is unsurprising. So 24% of Gen Z workers' primary reason for going into the office is social interaction. And this can be contrasted from the 20% of boomers who said that they never see a reason for needing to go into the office. So thank you, boomers, that's great. And so what's also really interesting is that this preference for going into the office for Gen Z and their desire to sort of be in person also tracks with the fact that only 6% of Gen Zers said that video calling is their preferred means of workplace communication. So in this space, we talk a lot about video calling as being really important, but it sort of seems like Gen Z, who had a lot of their education sort of with the glazed eyes of video calling, sort of want to be in person, and that might constitute a need for refocusing in the industry.
So what does this mean for service providers in this room? Product managers should be looking at how they can sort of capitalize on better hardware, so better devices, home office kits, just making life a bit easier for Gen Z when working from home. Networking solutions could also potentially play quite a big role in that, so connectivity, security, all very relevant for Gen Z. The preference for office also means there could be a sort of office refresh in which service providers could capitalize on, and that's also maybe from a hardware perspective, so office kits, better noise cancelling headphones, all those bits of technology. What Caitlin and I took away from the video element of her presentation is that video is just less convenient for Gen Z than maybe perceived. I know I was also a bit video shy at home. So, for example, my flatmate once walked in wearing a swimming costume and I was on quite an important call. You really don't want to have that. So I think we are a bit more camera shy than we may let on. And I think, again, symptom of the pandemic, video wariness has really kind of set in for Gen Z, and that's particularly in kind of in a business setting. COVID is also still having a major impact on workplace communications and for all generations, but I do think particularly for Gen Z, the pandemic happened in quite formative years for us, so in our education, our sort of first jobs. And so any technology to kind of facilitate that in-person interaction that we really want, or a suitable virtual alternative, so in a way that video has not quite served, would be really, really revolutionary and would really serve a kind of niche in the market. Potentially maybe the metaverse, AR, VR serving a role there. So the key takeaways from this presentation, I think I would say that Gen Z have had a bit of a hard time, transition to sort of post-pandemic life, teething problems, working from home issues, now the cost of living crisis. I think we deserve a bit more slack and sympathy. We're not quite as snowflakey as perceived, and I think if you worked with us, we would be much more responsive potentially.
And it's also not all doom and gloom for the Gen Z generation. We're really enthusiastic about workplace technology. We're still using our phones, which is great. And we're going to the office more, which is a huge positive for sort of the future of the industry. And both Katie and I sort of thought that it would be remiss on International Women's Day to sort of not talk about other really interesting sort of insights we got from our enterprise research that aren't just about generational differences, but also sort of gender differences. So this enterprise research found that still there are far more men in C-suite executive positions than women in sort of the people that we surveyed. And in terms of communication preferences, women across all generations felt much less confident than men in making phone calls and confidence on the phone. So we just thought that highlighting that disparity was really important today. So
yeah, in terms of sort of generational differences, but also in terms of gender differences, those are sort of really key criteria for providers in this room to sort of try and take away and inform their future strategy. Thank you very much for listening to our keynote. We're here for the rest of the afternoon, so please do come to us with any more questions. And yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.